So, hello, comrades, and firstly, it is 1st of January. It is the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. I wish all the comrades Happy New Year. I think that the 2022 there will be year of the class struggle, especially in Poland. We see the rising of the prices of everything, big inflation. The Polish people are angry, but unfortunately we don't have strong communist party which can organize this people to fight. So today we will speak about big communist party which existed in the past, one of the biggest communist party outside the socialist bloc. It will be very sad conversation because we will talk about the massacre of the communists in Indonesia. And before we start, I want only to make short advertisement information about tomorrow. Tomorrow I will speak with comrade John Catalinotto from USA. Who it will be 4 p.m. European time. We will speak about the anti-war movement in the time of the Vietnam War. Okay, so Bruno, I prepare also the slides about this event. So Bruno will talk and I will show you the slides.
Okay. So I'm beginning.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yes, but first, of course, before we talk about the massacre in 1965, we have to know what was the Communist Party of Indonesia, because Indonesia was one of the biggest colony in the world. Indonesia is a very big country, and it was, of course, the biggest country belonging to the Dutch colonial empire. And the colonial, of course, everywhere colonialism was very hard for people, but it was especially hard in what is now Indonesia. At that time, it was called Dutch West Indies. And the Dutch repression in Indonesia was always very important. And the terror the Dutch used was also very, very strong. So that's one thing we have to understand. The second thing we have to understand is, of course, Indonesia, as you see on the map, is a country of 1,000 islands, and a lot of them are very big ones. And it's a country very diversified ethnically, linguistically, and even on the base of religion, because Indonesia is mostly a Muslim country with about 80% of the population is Muslim, but about 20% are belonging to other religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and animism. And Indonesia became Muslim quite late, because Indonesia was converted to Islam due to the activity of sailors and merchants. Earlier, Indonesia was a Hinduist country or a Buddhist country, depending on the time. And that's why the Indonesian culture is very rich and very very linked with different stratas. Which explained that traditionally the Indonesian Islam was rather a very tolerant and open-minded to new ideas Islam. And that's and the tragedy we will talk about in 1965 is, of course, a tragedy for the communists I will talk about, but to a certain extent we can also consider that on the other side it was a tragedy for the Indonesian Islam, comparing with the Islam of the very beginning, because we have to take into account that communism in Indonesia began out of a Muslim movement, which was called Sarakat Islam. It was a Muslim organization, anti-colonial Muslim organization, who step by step became more and more, let's say, influenced by the Russian Revolution. And out of Sarakat Islam develop from the Sarakat Islam the future Communist Party of Indonesia developed. So the basic roots of the Communist Party of Indonesia was anti-colonial and Islamic at the very beginning. And Indonesia was also well known for a man who all his life was Muslim, Tan Malaka, but he was let's say, Muslim theologian who developed something like an Islamic liberation theology. And he was cooperating with the communists, and he was quite a lot of time in Soviet Union before the Second World War. And why I talk about that, because as we can observe later, the Islamic movement in Indonesia will be taken over by the American and the right wing that will transform this movement, which was pretty progressive at the beginning, in a completely reactionary movement, and of course anti-communist. So that's a thing we have to take into account. The second thing, of course, we have to take into account, as I told you, the Communist Party of Indonesia was a very strong communist party already before the Second World War. He was fighting against exploitation and colonialism. But during the Second World War, Indonesia was occupied by the Japanese troops. And it's important to understand that the communists were against the Japanese occupation at the same time when quite a lot of nationalists in Indonesia collaborated with the Japanese, thinking that the Japanese, as Asians, were liberating Indonesia from Dutch occupation. And it's only at the very end of the Japanese occupation that part of the nationalists discovered that the Japanese were no more friendly to Indonesians that were earlier the Dutch. And this created the alliance, I would say, between Communist Party of Indonesia, some nationalist element under, particularly under the very well-known future president of Indonesia, Sukarno, who was a nationalist, but we would say that he was a left nationalist. And different movements, more or less Muslim, fighting for the independence of Indonesia. When the Japanese lost the war in 1945, the Dutch reoccupied Indonesia. Yeah, here you have the photo of Sukarno. The Dutch reoccupied Indonesia. And the national liberation movement began to fight against the Dutch, and at the very end, the Dutch had to resign from colonialism and recognize the independence of Indonesia. And Indonesia, at the very end, was independent at the end of the 40s under the chairmanship of Sukarno, and the Communist Party of Indonesia was a very strong part of this alliance. We have to take into account that the Communist Party at its peak time, it means in the 50s, had about more or less 3 million members of the party, not taking into account what is called the mass organizations, women organization, youth organization, trade unions, and a lot of other institutions, and and the Communist Party of Indonesia was for sure the strongest party in Indonesia, not only I would say because of its popularity, but also because this party was active grassroots almost all over the country, and I would say no Indonesian could live in an area where there would be no communist presence in the country. So it was a really mass party that was also very strong. And this alliance between the communist and the Sukarno president gave to Indonesia the very important role Indonesia had all over the 50s and the 60s, especially in 1955 with the Bandung Declaration. Bandung is a city in Bali, in Indonesia. In Java, actually, and the Bandung Declaration was the basic manifesto for decolonization between Sukarno, between Nasser, between Tito, between Nkrumah, between Nehru, all these people, and Chuen Lai also from People's China, all these people formulated the idea that colonial countries should be liberated, and that it's very important. No country, no power has the right to interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign countries, which is, of course, very important for weak countries such as former colonial countries. So the activity of Indonesia was very strong all over those years, and the prestige of Indonesia was extended to all the planet. I mean, Sukarno and Indonesia at that time was a country known all over the world as one of the forefront of the national liberation movement. And if the personality of the President Sukarno symbolized this non-aligned Indonesia all over the world, we cannot take this fact into account, not linking it with the strength of the Communist Party of Indonesia. What is very clear up to 1965, but I would say it's even clearer after, because when the communists disappeared from the political scene in Indonesia, officially Indonesia stayed as a non-aligned country, officially at least, but in fact Indonesia, even if it's a very big country, ceased to have any influence, not to talk about prestige, in the world from 1965. And this shows that without communists, Indonesia was not a respected country. That even if the president of Indonesia was not a communist, he was linked with communists, but he was not a communist, his prestige in the world, the powerfulness, I would say, of Indonesia in the world was linked with the power of the Communist Party inside Indonesia. And that's very important. And I would say that the American and the British were very clever in that way, that they knew that destroying Communist Party of Indonesia would destroy not only the prestige of Indonesia out of Indonesia, but its role in the non-aligned country. But I would say more, they understood, and they managed to succeed, unfortunately, on that way. But they understood that a destruction of the Communist Party of Indonesia will destroy the Indonesian society. And we, up till now, we can say, and there is a Czech journalist, Vilcek, who knew very well before he died Indonesia, and who described what Indonesia became nowadays. And he explained how the Indonesian society was destroyed due to the destruction of the Communist Party, which was the real base of the, let's say, social and political vitality of the Indonesian society. So when we talk about the Communist Party of Indonesia, we're not talking only about a political party, not talking only about a strong political party, but we are talking about something like a social structure that created the energy of the whole Indonesian society. As soon as the Communist Party disappeared, I would say that a large part of the energy of the of the Indonesian society, communist or non-communist, disappeared, vanished. And up to until now, even if the Indonesians managed to suppress the strong dictatorship they had under Suharto a couple of years ago, I would say that the vitality of the Indonesian society didn't reappear even in a much more democratic society. The pain, the destruction, the disintegration of the social structure of the Indonesian society realized in 1965 by the military coup, destroyed up till now the social structure, the social values of the Indonesian society. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking, of course, about communists, and we will talk about that later. But I'm also talking about the destruction of, I would say, progressive Islam in Indonesia, since I told you that Indonesia was a Muslim majority country. And as I told you, the first Islam we had in the 20th century in Indonesia was quite progressive and quite vivid. But the foreign spy agencies, and especially the British MI6 and the CIA, the American CIA, managed to take the control of quite a lot of Muslim organizations at the time in the 60s, and used them to oppress, and to kill communists. And if we observe the vitality of, as I told you, not only the communists, but of the Indonesian society as such, on cultural, on social, on economical, and political level before 1965 and after 1965, we can also observe that the Islamic structure in Indonesia were quite active, were quite creative before the Second World War, during the Second World War, and after the Second World War. But in the 60s, when they began to be taken under control of foreign reactionary power, they ceased to have any life, any social life, any creative life, any cultural life. And it's the other tragedy of the Indonesian, that all the structure we had in the Indonesian society ceased to be creative at that time, which appeared when Suharto, the dictatorship of Suharto, disappeared. The of course, the question of the massacres of communists came back at that time inside Indonesia. People didn't talk about that, but the Islamic organization who were directly involved in crimes committed against communists at that time made their, let's say, self-criticism and accepted the idea that they were wrong and that they committed crime and that they have to apologize for those crimes and so on. But still, it didn't make them creative again. I mean, it's I would say it's almost dead bodies in the Indonesian society. When I'm talking that the communists were killed and destroyed, that's one aspect of the thing. I mean, the opposition against the military coup in Indonesia was destroyed, but even the ones who, let's say, won the military coup began to be completely sterile and unable to push forward Indonesia, even if we take into account the fact that they couldn't manage to create a strong capitalist economy. They destroyed the potential of socialism in Indonesia, but they even didn't manage to create a strong capitalism. Comparing, for example, with the little Malaysia, which is a much weaker country, much less populated, much more little, but still Malaysian economy, Malaysian society is now much more advanced than the Indonesian society. And it's very important to understand that, because potentially Indonesia should be one of the most active country in Southeast Asia, and very often on the political ground, on the diplomatic ground, on social ground, on cultural ground, we observe that little Malaysia, and Malaysians are cousins of Indonesians. These two nations are very, very, they have a common culture, in fact. But the little Malaysia is less destroyed than Indonesia. Because the massacres of communists were so strong and so destructive for the whole Indonesian society, not only for the communists. So, of course, we have to talk about the communists, but we have to understand that the massacres of communists in 1965 was not only a tragedy for the communists, but it was a strategy for the whole Indonesia, including non-communists, and even to a certain extent, including anti-communists at that time. So that's the first thing we have to take into account. So as I told you, the Communist Party of India was more than 3 million members at the time, at the peak time of its influence, and it was a real society inside the society. And it was already the time of the Vietnam War, and the imperialists knew very well that Indonesia is a strategical country, and that they cannot accept the fact that Indonesia was a strong non-aligned country, not to talk about the fact that this non-aligned country had a very strong communist party. So they understood that this party has to be destroyed, and they used a pretext of a supposed coup, military coup, that some communist military had decided, which is a pure pretext to create a so-called counter-coup, which began mass repression. But as soon as the counter-coup, what is called the counter-coup, began, and it shows how it was planned earlier than the supposed coup, the military in Indonesia and Those organizations I told you about, among them the so-called Islamic or Islamist organization, helped repression against communists all over the country. Communists were arrested, killed, tortured, and so on and so on. We still, up till now, don't know exactly the number of people who were killed at that time. The lowest figures gives 500,000, but depending on different sources, it goes up to 2 million. So from 500,000 up to 2 million, of course, what I'm talking about, it's huge numbers of people that were killed in a couple of weeks, in fact, or a couple of months. And the party was in fact destroyed. Now we know something very important, that the US embassy had the name of all leading people that had to be arrested and eliminated. And we know also that the British MI6 had the long list of people that had to be arrested and killed. And this shows us, of course, that the military coup was not only an Indonesian coup, but it was planned, organized by foreign powers, especially United States and Great Britain, who, in a certain sense, we can say, supervised all the operation. And it shows, of course, then, and we can understand, it's very logical, that as soon as they succeeded to destroy the Communist Party, Indonesia, non-officially, but in fact, became an aligned country. Officially, Indonesia was still non-aligned under Suharto, the one who took power after the coup. But in fact, Indonesia went on the side of the American imperialism and British colonialism, which was, of course, as I told you earlier, very important at that time of the Vietnam War, because Vietnam is very near, and Indonesia was very important for a strategical region, because Indonesia is also the land which lies between Asia and Australia. And as you know, up to till now, Australia is one of the major base of the imperialism in the world. In fact, Australia is the United States in the Pacific Ocean, and Indonesia is the country very neighboring in the Australia and the south, and neighboring Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand in the north. That's, of course, one very strong aspect of this situation. So the massacres were of course horrible. You have film about that now. So I think you can find them even on YouTube. So I think it's very important, if you want to understand what happened in Indonesia, how the terror, the repression was organized. Now we can find it very easily. And it's important to know, because the Western propaganda, the bourgeois propaganda, is so strong that not a lot of people, even among the left, really know what happened in Indonesia, the mass massacres of 1965. And that's very important, and we have to remember that. Another aspect of what we of the consequences of the military coup in Indonesia is the fact that in all the Southeast Asia, but of course in Indonesia also, you had and you still have quite strong Chinese immigrants community. And in Indonesia, there were about 2 million Chinese, and some of them were linked with the People's China, with the People's Republic of China, or supposed to be linked with the People's Republic of China. So when the repression against communists began, there was also I would say a racist repression of the Chinese as such. So not only because of their real or supposed links with communists. In some case they had, in some case they didn't, because Chinese community are very diverse, and not all Chinese are communists. And in Indonesia that was the same. But the idea that Chinese were the base of communism in Indonesia was also used as a pretext, especially for Muslim extremists, to pretend that communism was a foreign importation in Indonesia, carried by Chinese, who are, of course, foreign agents. And so, apart from the massacres of the communists at the time, you had also the repression of everything what is Chinese in Indonesia. The Chinese language was forbidden, and the repression took also a racist aspect against Chinese, and this element is important. The other element also we have to take into account is that up to 1960, the Communist Party of Indonesia had, of course, good relation with all communist party in the world, and especially with communist party in power in Soviet Union and China. After the Chinese Soviet split in 1960, let's say the majority of the direction of the Communist Party of Indonesia took side of China, rather than Soviet Union, even if the Communist Party of Indonesia still had contact with Soviet Party, but rather the Communist Party of Indonesia had better, stronger relation with the Communist Party of China. And this also have to be taken into account, because as you know, after the Soviet-China split, the big majority of Communist Party, for historical reason and other reason, but basically for historical reason, took side of Soviet Union. So all the mass organization in the world, and especially the civil rights organization linked with communist parties, were more or less linked with the Soviet communist line. And this explains why when the Indonesian communists were massacred, we can say that the majority of the Communist Party of the world and their civil rights organization protested in a very superficial way, since the Communist Party of Indonesia was considered as a little bit too pro-Chinese. And this is another element we have to take into account, which shows us how important, how it was an important tragedy for the communist movement, this Soviet-China split. Of course, we can have different opinion about this split and the reason of the split and who is responsible for the split. But we, I guess, all have to agree to the fact that this split had tragic consequences for all communists, especially for communists in Asia, and most evident was the fact that the tragedy was very, very strong against Indonesian communists. So what happened after the repression of communists? The Communist Party was completely destroyed. Most of communists who were not killed were pushed in concentration camps and prison for a long time. And there was no, in fact, communist activities in Indonesia from that time up to very recently, because still now in Indonesia, the anti-communist laws are still, actually it is illegal to create in Indonesia a communist party. So now you have in Indonesia some quite little parties referring to Marxism, but there is no possibility to create a party referring officially to communism. Of course, the situation has improved because now it is openly, you can openly promote the image of Sukarno, the former president, and behind him, of course, already you can ask the question, yes, but under Sukarno, the Communist Party was one of the strongest party in Indonesia, and Sukarno agreed with that. So if you accept that Sukarno was right, you have to accept that the communists were also right. But still, this evidence was not accepted by the political structure in Indonesia, even if the nowadays government of Indonesia is quite left-wing. He is not able to destroy the police and military apparatus which take its root from the military coup in 1965. So we can say that up till now, people considered as communists, whether they are or not, are under very, very strong pressure from the police apparatus and the judiciary apparatus and the military apparatus. So I would say that Indonesia is now more or less democratic, but it's a democracy under control of the anti-communist terror squads taking their origin in the 1965 coup. And that's also one of the reasons why it is very difficult in Indonesia to have an open discussion about the massacres of 1965, because the victims of these massacres still in quite a lot of situation are fearing to speak, and perpetrators or their children or their family of those massacres are still in a position of creating social pressure against any trend tending to just to discuss about these massacres, to debate against these massacres, to show these massacres. So the situation is paradoxical in this sense that Indonesia is, as I told you, a democratized country but under control, and that we had to have people outside Indonesia, and most of the time non-Indonesian people, that could speak about that. As I told you, the Czech journalist Vilcek, or films, videos that were done outside Indonesia on this theme are important, but still it's in Indonesia difficult to discuss about that. The communists who survived, the Indonesian communists who survived, were outside Indonesia. They were in China, in Soviet Union, in France, and they tried to create something like a foreign bureau of the Communist Party of Indonesia. formally it exists, but still it is very difficult for them even now to have contact with their country and to be able to rebuild something in this country. And the biggest tragedy in Indonesia, the biggest, maybe not the biggest, but one of the big aspect of this tragedy is the fact that after the repression, after the massacres, you had also the propaganda apparatus of the Indonesian regime, which was functioning in a very, very, not only cruel way, but also in a very massive way. So to depolitize the Indonesian society. And when the Indonesian managed to take the street and conquer power, so the Suharto had to resign from power. There was a miscontent against the regime for a lot of reasons, but there was no political consciousness, because it's a country where the population lost its political culture, lost the image of what happened earlier, and the terror was so strong that children didn't know about the Communist Party, even when their parents were in one of the mass organizations of the communists in Indonesia. Most of the time, they don't know what is communist. They don't know their parents were linked with those organizations. All that is unknown. And inquiries made in Indonesia shows that the Indonesian youth, including young people who are developing, let's say, leftist ideas, they just most of the time don't really know what happened in 1965. They know that there was something like a communist party. They know that there was something like dead people at that time. But how it happened, why it happened, what was the strength of Communist Party in Indonesia at that time, all that they don't know. And they have to discover the history of their country back. Whatever they will think about that, they have to discover the history of their country, and they don't know most of the time what happened in their own country, in their own society in 1965. And so, that's a tragedy, because we can say that Indonesia is an amnesic country, and it explains to us this country doesn't play the role it should play, because when you look at Indonesia on the map, as you show, when you take into account that this country is one of the most populated countries in the world, Indonesia should be one of the most well-known country of the world. It's a huge country. It's a country with a very strong potential. And the role Indonesia is playing now in the world is much less important than it should be, and this is to a very, very large extent the consequences that this country as a society was completely destroyed during this military coup. So. Of course, we can discuss if there was 500,000, 1 million, or 2 million people killed in Indonesia. It's a very important, of course, issue. But I would say that more important is not only these millions of people killed, but what is important is the tens of millions of people who forget their memory at the time, and who were not able to transmit that memory to their children, taking into account, as I told you, that tens of thousands of Indonesians during the Second World War, after the Second World War, and up to 1965 were members of trade unions, women organization, youth organization, cultural organizations, and so on, linked with the Communist Party. And all that memory was destroyed during the 1965 coup. And that's a terrible tragedy for all Indonesians, not only for communists. Of course, for communists, it's a very strong tragedy, but it's a tragedy for the whole society. And as I told you, even the Muslim extremists who took part in these massacres, at least they recognized that what they did was a tragedy for their country. It doesn't repair the situation. It doesn't repair the Indonesian society. But it's important to know that they recognize that they destroyed their society. They not only destroyed communists, they did, of course, destroy communists, but they destroyed all the society, including, in a certain sense, themselves. And that's very important. And that's why the Indonesian situation has to be studied not only by communists. It has to be studied as an example of social disintegration, of social destruction carried on by foreign powers, because, as I told you, American and British were active in the organization of these massacres. Even if, of course, the hands realizing that were mostly Indonesian, but the brain of the massacres were in the British and the United States embassies and secret services. So it's something, I would say, devilish what they did in Indonesia, because it's a crime not only against communists, it's a crime against the Indonesian nation as a whole. It's something very important, and it shows that if you destroy one of the most important political organization inside the society, you destroy the whole society. And the Communist Party of Indonesia was concretely the biggest political organization of the Indonesian at that time. And the consequences are tragic up till now. So I don't know if maybe you have some question.
Of course that I have question. Firstly, I will read the commentaries which are here.
Yes.
So there is one comrade who confirm what did you say about Witczek, comrade Kolibri. Yes, Witczek also suggested that in 1965 massacres and destruction of the left in Indonesia also destroyed Indonesian society itself. First question, Yotazet. Why did not USSR and China help Indonesian communists to stop the massacre? And second question, did KP Gen, did Australia have any role in this counter-revolution?
Yeah.
And there is a comrade from Belarus who say hi. And there is often also the commentary. Often silence, a heavy silence born from the violence and the trauma covers up the horrors it takes effort to remember. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I will ask my question first. It is when you were in Poland in 1970s, the Poland in the socialist Poland, they have a lot of attention to massacre in Chile. Mm-hmm. They speak a lot about Cuba, about Greece. About Greece, there was the refugees from Greece in Poland, but if socialist Poland speaks about this massacre, because I don't remember that. I don't know, there was some monuments, some books. Of course, I am not speaking about Poland today. I am speaking about socialist Poland.
People's Poland.
Yes, yes.
Yes, as I told you, answering to the first question, it's USSR and China. Of course, both parties officially condemned what happened in Indonesia, but the Soviet Party was not really active. And in the same time, they condemned what happened in Indonesia. They were criticizing the fact that the opportunistic line of the Communist Party of Indonesia, linked with Chinese opportunists, is one of the reasons why this party was so weak at the moment when they were repressed. So, this created the situation that, yes, it's a pity that the communists are killed, but to a certain extent, that's the fault of their direction because they were pro-Chinese. And at the same time, of course, China condemned much more heavily. You can understand what happened in Indonesia. But China at that time was centered on two things. In 1965, Chinese were really fearing that the American would invade North Vietnam. And at that time, their first attention, China was not a superpower at that time. So they were concentrating on Vietnam war much more than and helping Vietnamese and Laotian revolutionaries. And Indonesia was a little bit too far for them to help concretely, especially that in 1965, already the internal tension in China that had to lead to the Cultural Revolution the next year were happening, and that a large part of, I would say, the energy of the Chinese leadership was concentrated on internal questions that was going to lead that country toward a cultural revolution. So I would say that China in 1965 was not really, that Chinese Communist Party in 1965 was not really active on the international scene. Even in the Asian scene, they were concentrated on Vietnam, Korea, and Taiwan. Eventually, Burma and Thailand, which the communists of this country were helped by China, but Indonesia was still a little bit too far from them to make them really help. To make them able to help really communists. So the tragedy of the Soviet-China split, as I told you, is one of the reasons I would say that both most important communist party of the socialist countries, the Chinese one and the Soviet one, were not really able to do something in that direction. I would answer to your question, and then I would come back to Australia, because your question is linked with what I say. Poland at that time was, of course, linked with Soviet Union. Polish party had the same reaction as I told you for Soviet Union. They were denouncing the repression against communists, but saying, the direction of the Communist Party of Indonesia was opportunistic, taking side of China, and because of that, they were too weak to fight against the fascist or the military coup. In Poland, I don't really know in 1965 because I was not there, but in the 70s, I know that you had at the Central Committee of Communist Party of Poland, I mean, of the Polish United Workers' Party, they were publishing regular informations about the world communist movement. And I remember that they published a book of listing all communist party all over the world and giving, a history of that parties in, let's say, 3 to 4 pages each. It was a very huge book. And the Indonesian Communist Party had only one page, when other parties could have 2 or 3 pages. And it was, in fact, the history of the party. And the last part was very short. The last part was that the party went on opportunistic policy with China, and in this situation it helped the American to create a military coup, and that a lot of communists were killed during the repression, not giving any number, any very important information. So if you wanted, and in Poland at that time, know what happened in Indonesia, you could, but you had very rare informations and not very accurate. And it was not the basic question. That you were right. I mean, the massacres in Chile, which were much less important than the massacres in Indonesia, were much more known than the one in Indonesia. And that's, of course, very important. Concerning Australia, I don't really know. I know that Australia at that time was linked with British colonialism much more than now, because the Commonwealth was still something really, really important. And I would say, but we have to make inquiry. I would say, I guess that the Australian secret services collaborated with the MI6, the British MI6, and I would be very surprised if they didn't help British MI6 in the repression of Indonesian communists, taking into account that Australia is 200 kilometers from Indonesia. So I guess it's very logical. It would be very logical that Australia, which was the base of American imperialism in the Vietnam War over Indonesia, Australia was active, militarily active in Vietnam. So I would be very astonished if the Australian secret services were not actively active in Indonesia with the British and the American one. But I don't know, and I didn't hear about that, so I don't want to answer something I don't know about. But I guess that now we can find documents in Australia, since when I talk about British MI6, it's because the archives, the British archives on this period have just been opened now, and now we know what the British did at that time in Indonesia. So I guess that is more or less the same situation in Australia, and I would like Australian historian to go and look at Australian archives if they don't find something about Australian activity in Indonesia. I doubt they didn't, because as I told you, Australia is 200 kilometers from Indonesia. So for the Australian government linked with British and American government, Indonesia was basic. And I'm pretty sure they should have take part in the massive repression against communists. But as I told you, it's better if Australian left historians go to have a look now at the archives in I guess in Canberra. I don't know exactly where they are, but anyway, I guess you can find something there now.
Okay, so if I good understand, even today in Indonesia, they can't say
not really
about it.
It's a mixture. It's a very strange situation, because it's a mixture of censorship and self-censorship. It means a lot of people up till now are fearing to talk about those events. The ones who were victims and family of victims, and the ones who were killers and family of killers. And so it's a taboo for a lot of Indonesian, outside from very, very general that there was a massacres, that this massacre was a tragedy, that this tragedy shouldn't have happened, but nothing really, systematic about this nationalist tragedy. And it's a tragedy because of that, the Indonesian society cannot become adult. It cannot become a society which is able to look at this past, at this tragic past, so to turn the page and go forward. And you have, of course, some leftist group in Indonesia which are working in those directions, but still, it's not a mass question, a mass issue in a country where it was a mass murder. And as I told you, it's a mixture of censorships and self-censorship.
Yes.
The fear is still working.
But is there in any country some commemoration about this? I don't know, monument. If we compare this
think that there is a monument in China. I think in the 60s there was, so I guess this monument is still there. I don't know, but I guess. I know that in different countries you have Indonesian refugees from that time that organized. Even in Paris, you had a restaurant which was organized by Indonesian communists, an Indonesian restaurant, of course. But that's right. That's something the communists in the world, whatever they are of Soviet or Chinese, or let's say origin, should talk about that, and to a certain extent, that's something that can help Indonesian nation to rebuild its memory. And that's a duty we have. Of course, maybe it's easier to do in Asia or in Australia because it's neighboring countries, but still, why not to help that in Europe? I mean, there are Indonesian in Europe, so we can help them to organize something about those massacres, to publish something, to talk about that. And it's also very important for communists to understand that Indonesia is the symbol of the tragedy of the Soviet-China split. Of course, it's not easy to take side who was right, who was wrong at that time, and so on and so on. That we can have very different opinion about the Soviet position, Khrushchev, then Brezhnev, the Chinese position about that split. But we can at least agree on one thing, that it was a tragedy for the whole communist movement all over the world. It was not only a tragedy for Soviet Union and China, it was a tragedy for the whole communist movement in the world. And we have to think about that, and to discuss about that, and to debate about that, and even to have different, because there would be, for sure, different voices, but we have to understand this tragedy is indirectly responsible of the millions of killed Indonesians.
Okay, so there is the question: how did the Dutch colonization of Indonesia look like? And there is also a comrade from Odessa. Odessa also it is a
Yes,
city of the massacre.
yes.
He wrote in Russian. Приветствую, товарищи, с Новым годом вас. Желаю всем в Новом году здоровья, счастья и успехов во всех ваших делах. He said, Happy New Year and good luck in our struggle.
And a good
I
luck in his struggle in Odessa, because I guess in Odessa it's not very easy by now to be a comrade.
Yes, and I would like to ask about this
Bandung,
Bandung,
Bandung.
Bandung conference. What was a position of socialist Poland to this Bandung
Yeah,
conference?
so I finish with the Dutch colonization, and I would talk about Bandung. The Dutch, as I told, the Dutch colonization was one of the worst one, because Indonesia was just an exploitation country, exploited country. The Dutch had a very, mercantile look at what was Indonesia, and they had no. I would not say that the French or the British were having a good intention toward their colonized people, but at least they pretended that they will develop a cultural elite in these countries and so on. But the Dutch, they didn't have that ambition. They had just the ambition to plunder the country and to repress every movement. And this is one of the reasons why the communists were so strong in Indonesia, because they were very well organized in a country which was massively rebelling against colonialism. So that's, of course, we don't really know about Dutch colonialism, because comparing with French or English colonialism, Dutch colonialism was much weaker. But if we compare Holland, the little Holland with Indonesia, and bigger France or England with their colonial empire, the proportion is not so different. I mean, the metropolis and the colony, the proportion are more or less the same. So we have to think about that when we think about Dutch colonialism, which was quite a devastating colonialism also. Concerning the Bandung Conference, it's in 1955, so it's before the change in Soviet Union, before the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of Soviet Union and the Khrushchev report. That's important. The second thing we have to take into account is that the communists, the Bolsheviks first and the Communist Party of Soviet Union later, were pretty well informed about Indonesia during the 20s, the 30s, and that Indonesian communists had a strong role inside the Communist International, and inside, of course, the anti-colonial movement. So the Bandung Conference was, and we have to take also into account that the Bandung Conference was also organized with the participation of China, and especially with Zhou Enlai. And at that time, of course, China was linked with Poland and all Eastern European socialist countries. So the Bandung Conference was very important for socialist countries, because it showed that the besieged socialist country, we have to take into account that in the 50s, the socialist countries were besieged by American imperialism, and Indonesia, India, Egypt, as countries liberating themselves from colonialism, were a good footsteps to change the balance of power in the world. So the Bandung Conference was hailed in the socialist countries, in Poland and other countries, as very important events. And we have, concerning especially Poland, we have to take into account the fact that in the same year of Bandung, we had in Warsaw the World Festival of Youth, which was organized by a progressive and communist youth organization all over the world. And these young people, including Indonesian youth, came to Warsaw for this festival, which was political and cultural in the same way. And it was very important because, in 1955, Polish people were not accustomed to meet in the street people of, let's say, non-white color skin. Because, Poland was a European country, which was not a colonialist country. So, I mean, normal Polish people and average Polish people never see in his life any people from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia. It was something completely unknown for Poles. And we have to take into account that Poland in 1955, it's only 10 years after the end of the big tragedy of the Second World War. So you can imagine the fact that in Warsaw you had so many young people coming from Asia, from Africa, from Arabic countries, from Latin America, mixed with people coming from France, from Italy, from Western country, mixed with people coming from all socialist countries, including North Korea, including China, Soviet Union, Bulgaria, and so on. You can imagine that this festival had a huge impact on Polish youth and Polish intellectuals at that time. The Polish youth discovered, their friends all over the world. It was a big fiesta in Warsaw. I mean, it's something we forgot today, but it was a huge event. And this happened in the same time of Bandung. So all that was mixed. And this, this generation of Poles were very optimistic and very open-minded to the whole world. It began at that time in 1955, 1956. You began to have in Poland books about these countries, to have reviews like Continenty, about third world countries, about African culture, Asian cultures. You had Polish journalists which were sent to different countries, so of course to Bandung, but all over Africa and Asia. Poland was at that time much more universalistic than now. Because now Poland is looking only at the West, but at that time you had a lot of Polish intellectuals which were interested by the Latin American literature, by the Indian political life. You had Oskar Lange, one of the biggest Polish economists, who went to India to implement the planification system of India at the same more or less time. Now Poland, what Poland has almost no relation with India. Poland now has one embassy in Africa. At that time, Poland was sending more and more diplomats to different countries of Africa. As soon as one country was decolonized, there was a Polish delegation going to Kenya, to Tanzania, to Guinea, to different countries. Now it's finished, all that. And of course, Indonesia and Bandung had a strong echo. I mean, the nowadays Poles don't know. I told you earlier that the Indonesian lost their memory because of the massacre. But I would say, of course, in a much less violent way, but that the Poles lost their memory because they even don't know what happened in Warsaw in 1955. They don't know about the youth festival, but they don't know about the impact of the youth festival, the International Youth Festival, on Polish youth of that time. When you had a Polish girl dancing with a Ghanaian communist, or with an Indian communist, or with a Peruvian communist, of course, there is something sentimental in this. There is something cultural in this. There is something political in this. But those people will not be the same way when they come home. And you can imagine that a Polish girl who never see all her life any people from any of the southern colonized at that time country, and discover huge people, lot of people coming from all these continents in a couple of days. It's a complete revolution in their head. And it was very great. I mean, when you have a testimony of that time, you understand that, the world was changing. And that's why the regression we are experiencing now is a complete tragedy, because Poland became a complete provincial country when it was almost the capital of the world for a couple of weeks in 1955. The still half ruined the Warsaw after the war, because Warsaw was not completely rebuilt at that time. It was already to a certain part rebuilt, but it was not completely rebuilt. You can understand that people coming out of this horrible war and discovering Africa, discovering Asia, discovering China, discovering Peru, discovering Brazil, it's a complete cultural revolution that we forgot, completely forgot. And of course, the government of Poland we have during the last 30 years made everything to have people forgot that at that time Poland was on the map of the world. Now Poland is at most on the map of the Western world, but the rest of the world completely ignore Poland, because Poland ignored the rest of the world.
I think that one day we need to make a lot of another lecture about this event, also to not only to say is to the comrades from the world, but also for the Polish comrades who.
Yeah, it's very important because it's part of Polish history.
And it is something which Polish communists can be proud. So I would like to ask you about some technical details of this massacre, because when we compare this, I don't know, the Hutu massacre, Hutu Tutsi, it was something that there was a radio. They all the time in this radio they said that we need to kill, and it was something like this. In the Chile there was a coup d'etat, and they arrest people, concern these people in the stadium, and after they massacre these people. Could you say something about the role of the embassy of the United States and how it is worked, that United States take information in all the countries, that embassy of the United States have all information about the members of the communist parties, and
they had not the list of all the members, but they had a very important list, and they helped the Indonesian military to improve the way they prepare their list. I would say the American and the British were the, let's say, advisors how to organize a list of people you have to arrest and make them quickly disappear. And the big difference between Indonesia and, let's say, Chile, it's also partly due to the fact, of course, that Indonesia is an island country and is a disseminated country, is that the massacres were done, I would say, in a decentralized way. It means that most people were killed more or less killed at the place they were arrested, sometimes publicly. Sometimes not publicly. Sometimes people knew they were killed. Sometimes people don't know. You have still in Indonesia a lot of people that who don't know what happened with their family members. They don't know if their family member are killed or not up till now, because some of them disappeared definitely, and some of them disappeared and were liberated after years, after tens, 20 years, or after the fall of the Suharto regime. So you have people that went back to their place, that people thought they were killed, and they didn't. They were not killed. But on the other side, you have people who disappeared and you have no proof that they were killed. Now they find, mass graves here and there. You had people that were hanged, you were people that were fired, you had people that were put on the river, you had people that were killed in sea. They were how to say, drop, yes, in the sea. You had everything. You had people discovering on the river floating bodies coming from other villages up the river, and you didn't know why they were killed. Of course, you could imagine that they were killed for political reason, because it was the time where they were killing communists. But there was no inquiry, there was no document, there was nothing to tell them. And most of the worst, of course, of all what happened is that a lot of them were, before being killed, were tortured in a very, very cruel way. What happened when you can see now in the video I talked to you about, and the one you show here on the screen, and they were tortured, they were killed in a very, very different way. And what is tragic also in Indonesia now is that you have some people that killed at that time, and that torture at that time, and that publicly up till now consider that what they did was right, and they are proud of what they did, and they say they are proud of what they did. And they say that, yeah, I'm a murderer, I tortured those people, and it was a good thing, and I'm proud that I did it. And in a society which is supposed to be democracy, it looks strange. At least people, murderers that are happy that have been murderers. So that's why the history of Indonesia is not finished. These events, they are still tragic for the Indonesian people. Yeah, I saw, for example, an interview of 3 sisters who were a communist, young member of the Communist Women Association at that time. They were in camp, and they were later freed, and they went back to their village, and they say they don't talk about that, what happened to her. And people of the village don't talk about that also. People want still to ignore what happened. They just behave like if they weren't there. They went back, okay, but they don't talk about that.
So I have impression that the extreme right which exists today,
Yes, of course.
all these fascists which existed in Poland, in
Yeah.
USA, in Western Europe, very often they are celebrate the memory of Pinochet, and they said, we will make
Hmm.
we will kill you the communists in the way like Pinochet did. But because of the racist mentality of these fascists,
Yeah.
they even don't know about that the Pinochet was a little guy, comparing him in
Yeah,
this
that's right.
anti-communist activity with Suharto. Uh,
Yes, maybe it's because of racism, but maybe it's mixed with the fact that even they uh, they cannot support the idea of a so big mass murder committed by their fellow comrades. The same, they don't accept up till day that Hitler killed so many people. They say no, Hitler didn't kill them. It didn't happen because even they cannot accept what their comrades, let's say, committed in Germany and in Indonesia. 30,000 they can accept, 1 million they cannot.
I will read the comment and ask my last question. So the comment is, Comrade Philip. Let's us then remember and resurrect socialist internationalism. It might be easier today than it was then. Leo Nomilini. Hello, is Mr. Drweski a university teacher? Is he in France? Thank you. And another comment of Comrade Philip. It is said in the press of Indonesia that the ghost of the Communist Party of Indonesia still haunt Indonesian politics, and the return of the PKI, it is to this day feared by politicians and the army. And I would like to ask if there was some how to say reaction of communists in Indonesia, if they take arms, if they organize the struggle like Chinese communists in 1927, they go to the villages, organize guerrilla movements, because you didn't mention anything about this.
Yeah. You're right. Now, concerning who I am, yes, I'm a university teacher in history and political science in the National Institute of Eastern Languages and Civilization in Paris. Concerning the communist ghost in Indonesia, you're completely right. It's for the anti-communists in Indonesia, it's a ghost, and they fear, and that's very. It can look strange, but in fact, it's not strange that in Indonesia you cannot organize a communist manifestation up to now. But you have anti-communist manifestation. Why we have an anti-communist manifestation in a country where there is supposed to be no communists? It's the proof that the ghost is still there. Because they know that as soon as the Indonesian will rediscover their memory, the memory of their family, the memory of their former militant, the ghost will be alive, and they are fearing that. Concerning organization, that's, as I told you, the Suharto military coup was supposedly organized as an answer to a military coup organized by the communists. But what happened is the proof that it's pure propaganda. Because if you organize a military coup, let's say, you have an organization to do it. And what happened is showing that the communists were not at all prepared for what happened. It means that as soon as the military coup took power, the party was not organized, so they arrested massively people so that the communists couldn't organize any resistance. Here and there was attempt to create some resistance, but it was so localized that the army very quickly stopped them. Basically, on the technically, I would say, the Suharto coup was very well organized. We can even say that on the if we look at the strict organization, it was very well done, because they did it very quickly, all over the country, all over a country which is a country of islands, so very difficult to organize. And they managed to arrest and eliminate so quickly communists, so they couldn't organize anywhere any form of real resistance. What shows that they were not prepared to make a coup. And we can even be surprised that they were so unprepared. But on the other side, if we take into account that they were in a good relation with the president of the Republic of that time, Sukarno, maybe they couldn't imagine that Sukarno will be replaced so easily by Suharto. So it was, of course, an error, but it's difficult to criticize them because Sukarno was a national hero, so it was difficult to imagine that he can be replaced in a couple of days. Even Suharto managed to organize his coup in a way pretending that Sukarno was on his side, which was not the case. But he had to manage a propaganda in that direction because he knew that Sukarno was popular.
So I will read the last question from chat. Are there any historians trying to document the massacres? And the comment, there is the comment, Leo Nomilini. This is a good channel. Thank you both. Thank you. We are doing this for the comments like this. And there is the comment, Calibre 1. The Communist Party of Indonesia wasn't prepared because this was the first time that a countrywide anti-communist massacre had taken place anywhere in the world. No one had any conception of this. And I would like to say that I appeal to the comrades, communists from all over the world, that we need to spread information about this very sad event. And I think that 8th of October, we need every year make something to commemorate the memory of the killing comrades from Communist Party of Indonesia. I don't have idea now what we can do, but it's obvious that this memory, especially in the time of this aggressive anti-communist propaganda, when every day, every minute they attacked us about the lies, about the communist crimes, they all the time multiply these crimes, they imagine new crimes, and this hypocrisy, they then they said nothing about how they killed the communists. So I hope that from this day now, every people who are listening this lecture will make something to spread this information.
Yes, concerning history, of course, there are some historians beginning to work on this subject, but of course it's very difficult. As I told you, journalists and how you say cinema technician did quite a good job on that field, but we need, of course, to have a historian working on that field. Of course, it's very difficult to work in Indonesia on that field, but as I told you, in United States, in England, in Australia, perhaps, and in Netherlands, we should, at least in these countries, we should find quite a lot of archives that can be very helpful in that purpose, and it would be very, very good to have students working on that issues. And as you told me, how it's very important to show the hypocrisy of the so-called human rights defenders, taking into account that they do not speak about people who suffered at that time, but who still suffer, because of course people are old now. The people who survived, they are old, but they still sometimes suffer in Indonesia, and their children are suffering because sometimes they don't know what happened with their parents or their grandparents. They don't know the history of their family. So it's a whole nation which is suffering, and we have to help them to understand what happened. Because we have sometimes a responsibility. We have a responsibility as communists, but we have also a responsibility as citizens of countries that helped what happened in Indonesia, more or less, depending on countries, but more or less we can say that all Western countries were responsible of what happened in Indonesia. So we have a responsibility as communists, and we have a responsibility as citizens of country which took part directly or indirectly to these massacres.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. It was very sad and pessimistic lecture, but very important.
Yeah.
And thank you all the viewers for question. I remember about my interview, which will be taken place tomorrow 4 p.m. European time. I will speak with John Catalinotto about the anti-war movement in the time of the Vietnam War. So see you, comrades, until tomorrow, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, and we hope to struggle victoriously in the next year.
Yes, it is the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution today. We have to remember.
Yeah. Okay.